The Senate, Faculty Senate, was having an executive committee meeting on the day of the sit-in. I was chairman of the Senate and of that meeting. President Odegaard was among those present. And we had a fairly long agenda. And as we, the last item on the agenda had a title like something like what's going on the campus, or consideration of events on the campus. And shortly before we got to that, some black students came in to the room quietly, and just a few at first and then more. And as I recall it, the first ones there just sat on the floor around the room. The room was adjacent to the president's office. It was his conference room. And so after a number of them had come in, we reached the point where I said, well, this is an appropriate time for consideration of our next item. And so we proceeded to that. And I don't recall what the discussion was, but more students came in, and it got fairly crowded, but not offensively crowded. And at one point, and I don't remember just when it was, but fairly early, there was a visitor from California. And he was obviously a person who was very respected. And some of the leaders among the black students, leaders just as one would judge by their behavior rather than they were not elected leaders, obviously knew him. And so they had some conversations and they were quiet, and I don't recall anything specific that resulted from his presence other than sort of the tone of the meeting. And that seemed to be more serious. I can't again recall just what was being discussed, what items, and he did not speak at all. Other than that, it was just a continuation of a discussion of the issues on between the black students and the university administration. And Dr. Odegaard did not participate in the discussion as I recall it. I knew that he was very interested in their legitimate goals, and I had been called up for my position as chairman of the microbiology department. Suddenly, I had a call from him, and he asked me if I would be willing to take a job, and I didn't know just what it would be, but I knew it would relate to the disturbances that were occurring on our campus and others with principally minority students. So anyway, I had been put in this position, and that was entirely a separate position from being chairman of the Senate. It just happened that these two coincided. And in fact, I was not at that time. I had not yet been appointed by Dr. Odegaard, as I recall it. But anyway, as far as the sit-in went, there was one alarming factor, and that was that we heard that the an authority in the it must have been either the county or the city related to law enforcement was planning to come to the campus. And as I recall it, we understood that Dr. Odegaard was stalling him. He didn't feel that this was necessary. In fact, I think that was the position, that he felt it was not necessary. There was nothing going on that would require that. but he seemed to be kind of a gung-ho guy and sort of restless to get going. So there was sort of a sense of pressure after a while. It got dark outside, and I heard there was some student climbing up by rope to come in a window, which was kind of an alarming scene. And there were lots of students on the ground down below on Red Square. And so anyway, this continued on, and it got pretty tense. It was a characteristic of these students that they did not have identified spokesman. And as I recall it, that was the case on that day. But anyway, our discussion went on for some time, and there must have been some communication between students and the faculty who were there for the executive committee meeting. And after a time, it reached a point where I felt we had exhausted the things that we as an executive committee would appropriately be discussing, and it was getting a little late. So I said, well, at this point, this ceases. I adjourn the executive committee meeting, and this becomes a sit-in. So it was a very peaceful transition, and nobody seemed terribly excited about it, but I'm sure there was a lot of apprehension in the room. Dr. Odegaard was taking the position with the officials downtown related to the police that did delay their departure very considerably, a matter of hours, and that if he hadn't done that, why, it could have been a lot more unpleasant. I felt when I came here that one thing I wanted to do was to develop a relationship between the medical school and the rest of the university. There had been, and this is not unusual, some feelings of envy or hostility between different academic units and between the medical school, I felt, and some of the arts and sciences. And so I had been elected to the Senate as one of the minor measures along the way a number of times, and I remember sitting in Senate meetings and thinking, this is really the dullest way to spend my time. but there was I had a feeling that there was potential value in that, and it did emerge in several different ways. But it meant that at the time this was developing, I knew people, faculty members and administrators all over the campus. And when the issues on campuses, including ours, began to heat up, there was one assistant to the president who was dealing with some of this, but he was neither by his own inclination or his particular abilities particularly suited for this. And so I had been alerted in advance by one person very close to the president that this other person was thinking about me as a possible person to move into that job. And so he called me up in advance before he suggested it to Dr. Odegaard and said I might be getting a call. No, in fact, that he was going to speak to Dr. Odegaard and that I might be getting a call about it. So one day in my office in microbiology, I got this call, and I was very interested, just my own sense of what was going on all over the world at that time, actually, as well as what I would be interested in doing. So on that day, I cut off my responsibilities in microbiology as far as I could, and that was pretty far, and moved up to the administration building within a few days, and I had an assignment from Dr. Odegaard simply to work with the minority students and others who might be involved in this sort of activity. And I held that position for about 2 years. Dr. Odegaard was certainly, should be credited with a great deal of progress without turmoil here. There was what some people would consider turmoil. We all did at some points. But as I recall it, he told me that in the days before the Civil War, his predecessors in the family had participated in the Underground Railroad. So he had a background in this sort of thing. And his attitude, as I saw it all the way along, was one of assisting with the progress on issues that would relate to improving educational opportunities for minority students, and this was very helpful. And I think the students, the leaders, understood that, but they had to, in my sense, my understanding, they had to maintain an attitude of hostility as part of the way of achieving their goals, and so there was a very interesting relationship between the goals and the ways that they were being achieved. I've never had more efficient communication between myself and another person in higher status in an organization than what I did with Dr. Odegaard. If there were needs that I saw, and I would speak up, and he would find a way of meeting them. But when I first came up to that office, I didn't know what to call this program that was emerging, and I knew so little about education that I didn't realize that special education had a different meaning than the kind of thing I was dealing with. So as I recall it, I called it a special education program, and it was later that we changed the name to Educational Opportunity Program, and so that's why I was involved while it was a special education program. And the goals included, as a very central point, that this program should not be just for black students. It should be for students who were deprived for one reason or other, whatever, from having a full opportunity for education at the University of Washington. And this meant, in general, students from minorities who were underrepresented on campus. Underrepresented meant that they, as a proportion of students, were below the number expected on the basis of their proportion in the general population. And this would be principally students of certain racial groups, but also students who had grown up under poverty. And I didn't know enough sociology and so on to know how you define poverty. But I knew we had to have a definition that was clear, and so it meant that during their growing up, they had been in families that were living on welfare. That was a general guideline. And the goal was to improve their chances of getting a good education. And the standards would be that they should have all of the opportunities that students in a more favorable economic situation had. Another thing that emerged as a goal was the importance of the students getting degrees. And Dr. Odegaard brought that out at one point after probably a year or more of the program, that the university's goal should be produce students who did get degrees, completed their education, got degrees. Well, I felt that among the students who were coming were quite a few who would be very definitely benefited and would be better citizens and more capable to perform, even though they did not get their degrees. So I remember at one point near the end of the time that I was working on this program, I made a comprehensive report to the Senate. This would be in the Senate minutes. And in that, I cited, I think it was 5 students, and I, for each one, described how their entrance qualifications were so poor that they never would have been accepted under ordinary circumstances, and how after they had been in this program for a certain time, for a significant time, they did show evidence very clearly that they had gained a great deal of advantage out of this. And I felt that this was an important accomplishment, as well as those who got into the program and went on and got degrees. And most of them, of course, did not get degrees. They did not stay that long. There was recruitment of students. And this was done principally by students, together with some staff members. But they were pretty free and loose with their techniques of recruiting over, say, across the mountains in the agricultural areas, and elsewhere. It was hard to keep an appropriate rein without being too restrictive. And I did not get too involved in that, except at the level of where the students were coming in and what happened to them after that. I identified Sam Kelly, whom I had heard about. He was teaching in a community college and had a master's degree, obtained, I believe, while he was in the military in the Middle East, studies of the Middle East. So I got him on the advisory committee, and so he became very familiar with the issues that were going on, and he met some of the students who, in fact, were potential leaders, as well as faculty who were, like James Goodman, who were actively interested. And I thought that he would probably be a good successor for me. I talked to Dr. Odegaard about it, and I knew that nobody could come into this position unless he or she could get approval of the black students. And that, I had thought, would mean the Black Student Union. Now, the Black Student Union, from my perspective, was pretty disorganized. And that I think, is a essential part of the structure that helped these organizations to be effective. It turned out that it was difficult to get the Black Student Union to give any decision about Sam Kelly. And this was an issue. There's nobody who could go to within the Black Student Union and say, take this up and let us know how you feel about it. And so we went through quite a period there. I don't recall how long it was, when this was an issue that seemed to me to have should have been settled very simply, but it wasn't. And finally, there was somebody who was elected president of the Black Student Union. I wish I remembered his name, but he was a student in pharmacy, and he had not been particularly prominent in the issues that I dealt with. But he did finally take the issue to the whatever group he felt necessary, and I don't know whether he personally or simply got some other kind of backing, but he clearly did get approval of Sam Kelly as the one to take this position. And so that worked out well. I've got to tell you a little story about that student. I'm sure it was the one that I introduced to Dr. Odegaard down in the auditorium in the medical school when he came down there to give a speech. On the same day that a large piece of heavy equipment that was in the hole that was being dug for the parking lot that's down there now, that's under the red square, and the digging, the excavation had resulted in kind of a bench partway down, and then there was some further removal of soil down below. And some of the students got to this equipment when it wasn't being occupied, and they got that piece of equipment to go over the brink and down into the mud. And this particular student had been among those who were down in the mud. But he also showed up at the meeting down in the auditorium in the medical school where Dr. Odegaard gave a talk. And I introduced the student to Dr. Odegaard, and neither of us mentioned anything about the mud on his shoes, because it was still there. I had a little office in the administration building very close to the president's office. And they used to, among the leaders, those you've mentioned, and others, would stop in and visit occasionally. And I can tell you a couple of incidents that will show you sort of how things were. I heard that there was going to be a protest by the Asian students. They had seen that the black students were making progress. And they wanted to have a protest to show they were here too. And so I arranged for them to have a small auditorium to go to, which was up one floor above the president's office. It's a fairly small auditorium. And so the day came, and I don't recall the details, but as it proceeded, the students came, a moderate number of them, and as I recall it, there were some black students in the back, and they were kind of coaching the Asian students, and it came off pretty well. So that was one incident. Another was that I had on my in my office, back of my desk chair, there was a small bookcase. And one book that I got that I did a lot of reading in this field in those days was a Black History by Franklin. I don't know if you know he's a scholar at the University of Chicago. I'm pretty sure, I'm sure.
Oh, no, I didn't know. Sorry.
No, but the thing is that the black students, it was a pretty thick book. And the black students would come in and see that, and they'd talk about it a little bit and page it. And that was pretty nice. And so I got 5 of them. And as they came up and talked about it, so on, I'd loan them a book. And 5 went out and none came back. I remember E.J. Brisker very well. E.J. and Carl Miller, and who was the third one? Was it Larry Gossett? The students who counted in the sense of being leaders, like the 3 that we've just talked about, I knew wanted me around. And I remember one of those 3 said to me at one point when I must have been talking a little bit about moving back to the medical school. He said, "Well, we need you here." So I felt that, yeah, you do. So my wife I knew she was very concerned at various times. And I was sorry for that. I didn't want her to be concerned, but it was only realistic. And there were some violent incidents that occurred around some other universities, and so that was not surprising. And I remember a conversation, must have been with Dr. Odegaard, although it might have been somebody else very close to him, in which it was said that when Dr. Odegaard left the office, before he got home, his wife was concerned for his life. I don't think it was any one particular threat, but it was just the situation that he lived under during those days. In the midst of it, there were lots of times when people who would seem to be right in the midst of the turmoil were pretty peaceful. For instance, at one time, the administration building, the word got out that the administration building might be bombed, and the building should be cleared. So I, among others, went up and down the halls telling people, I have to get out of here. And Hogness was then the president. I don't know whether he was at that time acting or was a full president, but anyway, he was in his office. And I just opened the door and told him this was going on. He said, okay. And he stayed in his office and just went ahead and did his work. So he did not seem to be perturbed or concerned at all.